What you don't want, however, is anti-competitive conduct. And that is something where you're trying to keep out a competitor or keep out an application or things like that. And that is where things start to get confused.
Well, in that vein, and you actually exactly mirrored, I blogged about this last year, and I said, if you have, for instance, a heart scan transmitting from a hospital to a doctor, you want that to have priority over, grandma downloading her email. I mean, that's great, but that probably needs to have less priority over things that are very, very important. Or if you're making your multi-million-dollar presentation across the internet, and this is a make it or break it job for you, that needs to have priority, as you say, with the video and the audio and whatnot. But don't we already have many rules in place that can be used? For instance, I know the big case with this was the Comcast versus FCC, right? Comcast was limiting or dialing back access to a file sharing service, which is technically illegal anyway, but besides that point, they were dialing back or blocking access to a file sharing site, and the FCC got involved and said, hey, you can't do that, and they were already prosecuted under existing laws that are out there to prosecute with, right? So isn't that, what advantage is there to these new rules over laws we already have, freedom of speech we already have, not discriminating against companies or people or whatever we already have? So how is this, what is the FCC's reasoning that this is better, that we need additional rules and regulations in order to enforce that?
Well, you just put your finger on it. First of all, we all want an open internet that maximizes consumers' freedom. And that's what we've had since the internet was privatized in 1994.
Right.
It's acted that way. It's acted that way precisely because it is loosely knit and it is not governmental. It's not top down, it's bottom up. Right. It really empowers individuals. So, but should there be a concentration of market power and abuse of market power, in other words, sort of a monopoly and that's abusing its monopoly, there are laws in the books to prevent that. There are antitrust laws, there are competition laws,
right.
There's deceptive trade practices laws under the Federal Trade Commission. And so it's just like any other business. If there's a concentration and abuse of market power, you can go after them and should. The less than a handful of cases that the proponents of these rules point to were all resolved sometimes within hours,
right.
also within days. The case you pointed out, the Comcast versus BitTorrent was the name of the peer-to-peer file sharing company, was resolved on their own. But months later, the FCC still came out with the order, which was slapped down by an appellate court back in April, because saying the FCC didn't have the authority to do that. So there are laws in the books if we're worried about anti-competitive conduct and abuses of market power. There are laws in the books to prevent that or to go after bad actors if you can't prevent it. But thus far, this debate's been raging now for, 6-7 years maybe, and none of the parade of horribles that the proponents of the new regulation want has occurred. And the incidents they can point to are minimal and have all been resolved. And furthermore, the FCC in 2007 and the Federal Trade Commission in 2007 examined the broadband market, looked into this issue, could find no evidence, zero evidence of abuses of market power. The Obama Departments of Justice and Commerce filed comments with the FCC just this January 2010, and came to the same conclusion. And the Antitrust Division of the Obama Department of Justice, to their credit, warned against imposing new rules because that could actually stifle investment and innovation in the broadband market. So there are a lot of unintended consequences that could come about as a result of this.
Well, and I think, another unintended consequence that's been discussed, at least among my peers, and I am actually by trade a geek, so, I'm very into technology and all of that. I know all about this stuff. And one of the things that we've often discussed is if net neutrality passes, we believe the days of cheap internet are gone. You will then begin to pay essentially by the byte, and no matter who you are, whether you're a giant company or a tiny person. No more of these $19.99 all-you-can-eat deals on the internet anymore. Do those opposed to net neutrality within your organization see that as an unintended consequence?
There are actually some advocates who want there to be no tiered pricing. So what that will do is actually drive up costs. So let me give an example. Cable modem, some people don't know it, but you actually share bandwidth with your neighbor.
Right.
It's a shared network. Same with wireless. You share bandwidth with your neighbor. Okay. So grandma, let's say the hypothetical grandma who uses just a little bit of bandwidth, right, versus the kid down the street who's got file sharing software. They are both paying the same price right now. Okay. But the market wants to start responding and being able to tier that pricing so that the more you use, the more you pay for. You pay more. So that could be a market response which actually helps to manage bandwidth shortages in some cases for these shared networks. There are some who are advocating for you can't do that. You can't have what I call pricing freedom. Okay, so what that does is that doesn't mean everyone's going to pay grandma's rate. That means the price is going to go up to go compensate for the heavy bandwidth users. You know, if you want a commercial grade pipe into your house, you got to pay a commercial grade price. So that's one argument. But you know, the other part of all this is regulation always imposes costs. It's like a tax. Economically, economists will tell you regulations act just like a tax because they raise the cost of things. And not only the known cost, but the unknown cost, those unforeseen, unknowable consequences that come about as a result of new regulations. So absolutely. And on top of that, what it'll do is slow down investment in this area. We've been told that by investors of all stripes and sizes that invest in all parts of the internet ecosystem, not just investors in the companies that build the broadband pipes, but investors in companies that are along what we call the edge of the internet, the devices and applications. And it's going to make things very uncertain. You know, investors can deal with a certain amount of uncertainty, but when you start injecting more brand new rules, there's litigation risk, and it could be years before any of that's clarified. So capital stays on the sidelines. Investors don't invest. Innovation slows down.
Right. You know, let's talk a little bit about some of the other countries such as Germany and the EU who have already implemented net neutrality or similar standards on their networks. And they've actually used this. And I know you kind of briefly touched on this earlier, that in America, they're not really talking about it as a way to limit what's on the internet or to stifle free speech. But when the laws are very ambiguous or they're written in very ambiguous language, in other countries, they are using it to start saying, well, these sites are causing too much disruption on the internet, or your application, you know, we favor it. We favor your application, so you should get special treatment. You know, maybe it's a government-style application. And I mean, is there any talk about that from opponents within the FCC that say this could happen if it's left to be very vague? Because I am concerned about that, to be completely honest.
First of all, the EU is taking a wait-and-see approach. They have sort of a fact-gathering proceeding going on right now, and they haven't actually taken a position or proposed rules. Okay. But you put your finger on another very good point, which is these terms in the context of these complex 21st century technologies that are changing every day. By the way, they're getting more complex and more wonderful, more powerful. Having to impose these terms. They are vague, and it's going to be up to different countries and jurisdictions within those countries to define what they mean. So the problem is, and internationally this is a big issue, and I wrote an op-ed in yesterday's Wall Street Journal about this, is once you have more government intrusion into this space, you're going to have more government intrusion into this space.
Right.
And regulation only spreads. It's like planting a seed, and then it gets watered, and it's just going to grow.
It doesn't shrink.
Jack Beanstalk. It never seems to shrink. It only seems to grow and get bigger. So, what the real problem globally has been state intervention with internet network management, not private sector mischief. You really can't point to major cases of that. But it's these governments intervening in this space and meddling with terms such as reasonableness or freedom. You know, China put out this white paper with a chapter entitled "Guaranteeing Citizens' Freedom of Speech on the Internet," and I don't want to have to live by China's definition of freedom.
Yeah, absolutely not. Definitely.